Good morning. I want to welcome everybody to the workshop presenting the proposed 15-day changes to ARB's small off-road engine evaporative emission regulation amendments. My name is Angus McPherson. I manage the Air Resources Board Monitoring and Laboratory Division's Testing and Certification section. I'm joined here today with Mike Miguel. He's the chief of the Quality Management Branch. Also here is Michelle Dunlop. She works with me in the testing and certification section. And finally, Dr. Christopher Dilbeck, who will be giving the staff presentation today. Just a couple things. I know we're running late, so before we get started, anybody needs to use a bathroom, they're out the back door to the left. And if there's an emergency where we have to evacuate the hall, there's exits to the front and to the rear, and the assembly point is in the parking lot, main parking lot. Is that correct, Paul? Okay, so with that, I'll yield the podium to Dr. Dilbeck, and he will give the staff presentation. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Christopher Dilbeck, and on behalf of the team working on small off-road engines, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. During this workshop, we will discuss draft 15-day changes to the ARB small off-road engine evaporative emission regulation amendments that were presented to the board in November 2016. Regulatory text that we're discussing today is still under development and is not yet being proposed for adoption. Once ARB staff has prepared the proposed changes, they'll be made available for public comment for 15 days. And we'll send out an announcement when those changes are published for proposed adoption. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. I will pause a couple of times for questions, but it's okay to interrupt if you have a question. And we also have an email address for those on webcast. If you'd like to send in questions to Michelle, she will get those on email on the address displayed now, and we can answer those throughout the workshop when we receive them. Okay. We'll start today's workshop with background information on small off-road engines and the board hearing in November. Then we'll discuss the draft 15-day changes. After that, we'll talk about stakeholder participation and outreach, updated cost estimates for the amendments, and the timeline for adoption of the amendments. This is a familiar slide for many of you, I know, but may be helpful for those who are newer to this category. Small off-road engines, or SOAR, are spark ignition engines rated at or below 19 kilowatts. Examples of equipment that's covered in ARB's SOAR regulations include residential lawn and garden equipment, such as lawnmowers and string trimmers, shown in the blue box. Commercial lawn and garden equipment, such as riding mowers, shown in the green box. And other utility equipment, such as generators and specialty vehicles, shown in the violet box, all of which are outlined with a thick black line. Equipment types that use SOAR and are primarily used for farming or construction, such as larger chainsaws and welders, shown in the red box, are federally regulated and not subject to ARB's SOAR regulations. Federal Clean Air Act preempts California from regulating those equipment types. SOAR are not used in licensed on-road vehicles, off-road motorcycles, ATVs, boats, snowmobiles, or model equipment, as these are regulated separately. Amendments to the ARB small off-road engine evaporative emission regulations were presented to the board in November 2016 in a public meeting, as I mentioned previously. After considering staff's presentation and testimony from SOAR industry representatives and the members of the public, the board adopted Resolution 16-14. The proposed amendments approved by the board will require all SOAR to meet emission standards and strengthen enforcement provisions to improve compliance. They'll require certification fuel with 10% ethanol to reflect commercially available fuel in California, and provide an optional streamlined fuel tank test procedure to allow manufacturers to conduct one set of tests to obtain certification with both US EPA and ARB. The board resolution directs ARB's executive officer to adopt the proposed amendments with minor changes to address concerns expressed by industry representatives. Those changes, which we're discussing today in draft form, will be made available for public comment for at least 15 days when they're proposed. Next, we will discuss the draft 15-day changes. The draft 15-day changes will further clarify certification and compliance requirements, provide more flexibility for manufacturers in meeting emission standards, ensure compliance with the emission standards, and improve the reporting requirements. Once the proposed amendments are approved and become law, they'll be implemented gradually over the next few years. The draft 15-day changes will ensure the timing of implementation is clear. This timeline on this slide details the implementation of some of the major provisions of the amendments. For model year 2018, sales reports will be required, and the amended certification and test procedures will be optional. The low permeation and small production volume fuel tank exemptions will still be available in model year 2018. In model year 2019, these exemptions will be eliminated. The extra year of availability for these exemptions under the draft 15-day changes will ease the transition for manufacturers. For model year 2020, all engines with displacement greater than 80 cubic centimeters must meet the diurnal emission standards, and the amended certification and test procedures must be used. Other topics clarified in the draft 15-day changes are listed here. Some of the language describing evaporative model emission limit requirements has been returned to the way it exists today to avoid the perception that manufacturers would have to test more than one model in an evaporative family. Emission standards have been expressed in terms of reactive organic gases and organic material hydrocarbon equivalent instead of total organic gases to be consistent with other ARB programs. An existing sentence allowing executive order numbers for evaporative components to be provided in a certification application that was unintentionally deleted has been restored in the draft 15-day changes. The requirement to submit all test data for an evaporative family has been modified, so only test results from emissions-related tests must be submitted. And the discussion of bias due to relative humidity in TP 901, the fuel tank test procedure, has been removed. I'll pause here for questions, if there are any. Yeah. We'll bring you a microphone, and just so everyone knows, let us know who you are.
This is Roger Galt with the Truck and Engine Manufacturers Association. On the bullet point on executive order numbers, I think I noted that you added tanks and canisters, but you didn't include fuel lines in that line. So I think it was intended to be there. It just isn't there.
Yeah, I did see your note to us on that, and they're mentioned in another paragraph.
Oh.
Somewhere
else, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that ability to submit the numbers is there.
Okay.
And I can point you to that offline.
Yeah, just so long as it's there, because fuel lines are one of the regulated components.
Yes. So the sentence we're discussing does not specifically mention fuel lines, but where they are mentioned in another paragraph of the regulation, it does say the executive order numbers can be submitted. Did we get any questions by email, Michelle? Okay. If there are no further questions, I'll move on with slide 9. The draft 15-day changes provide flexibility for manufacturers in testing and meeting emission standards. The draft changes will make testing fuel tanks with fuel caps optional, allow fuel line and grommet holes to be eliminated during fuel tank testing, as is done today, and allow 3 additional fuel line test procedures to be used beside SAE J1737, which is the procedure specified and used today. Fuel lines that are exposed only to fuel vapor or that are designed to return unused fuel from the carburetor to the fuel tank for handheld engines will not have to meet a permeation emission standard. The draft 15-day changes also include a less stringent fuel line permeation emission standard for fuel lines used on chainsaws at the request of industry, since chainsaws are sometimes used in cold weather where some low permeation fuel lines may become brittle. Draft 15-day changes also provide certification flexibility for manufacturers. The requirement to identify the lowest emitting model in a family and the requirement for new applicants to perform diurnal emission tests have been removed. Labeling requirements have been modified so that the location of manufacture of the evaporative emission control system and that will not need to be on the label, and component labels will not have to be readily visible when installed on engines. Also, if ARB requests a unit for inspection with the certification application, an applicant will be able to provide that unit when it is available rather than having to provide it immediately if one is not available. There are also provisions in the draft 15-day changes that are designed to ensure compliance with the emission standards, such as requiring replacement components to meet the emission standards starting in 2020 if they're usable on regulated engines. Also included in the draft changes is a clarification that ARB will test 5 samples of a component in a compliance test. During a compliance test, ARB may also validate the fuel tank nominal capacity to ensure the measured volume matches the manufacturer's declared volume to within 1%. Another addition in the draft 15-day changes is replenishing the fuel consumed during the 5-minute engine run before preconditioning the engine in TP 902. Reporting requirements have been modified in the draft 15-day changes to improve the information that ARB receives and to increase its usefulness. Sales reports will be required annually, not quarterly as was suggested in January when we released another version of the draft changes for the discussion in a working group meeting. And those sales reports will include sales by equipment type, engine family, and fuel tank volume. Manufacturers will also be required to describe any quality assurance or quality control protocols they use for their evaporative families in their certification applications. I'll pause here again for questions. Any on email, Michelle? Okay. Yeah. Just as a reminder for anyone on the webcast, if you'd like to submit a question, please send it to Michelle at the email address shown on the screen now. Let's go back. Okay, we'll move on to slide 13. Next, we'll discuss stakeholder participation and outreach. Most of the draft 15-day changes were prompted by comments and requests from industry representatives throughout the rulemaking process. ARB staff have had several discussions with manufacturers during the development of the draft 15-day changes and discussed a previous draft of the changes in a working group meeting on January 31st. During the working group meeting, the topic of carbon canister purging in the diurnal emissions test was discussed. ARB staff expressed a desire for industry to share their data on canister purge rates and diurnal emission rates when the canister is not purged prior to the hot soak test. And we did have some of that data shared with us yesterday, which is not reflected here due to the short time frame, but so everyone knows, some of that data has been shared with us and we're reviewing it now. Although the proposed amendments aligned the slosh test in TP 901 and TP 902 with that in US EPA's regulations, manufacturers requested that the existing procedure continue to be allowed as an option. The draft 15-day changes include that option, as well as the alternative fuel line test procedures mentioned on a previous slide. The timing of the elimination of the low permeation and small production volume fuel tank exemptions was also discussed, with the result being that the draft 15-day changes provide those exemptions through model year 2018. Carbon canister purging is a topic of ongoing discussion and is another topic that was discussed with some industry representatives yesterday in a meeting. The current procedure involves purging the canister with 400 bed volumes of nitrogen or dry air after preconditioning. After this, the engine is run at maximum speed for 15 minutes and placed in a shed at 95 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 hour for the hot soak test. The engine is then cooled to 65 degrees Fahrenheit before the diurnal emission test. In the proposed amendments, as first released publicly on May 13th, 2016, the first step of purging the canister with 400 bed volumes of nitrogen or dry air was deleted, as such a large volume of purge air was not believed to be representative of real-world use of SOAR. Some of the data shared with us yesterday suggested that that may be the case for some engines. So I just want to acknowledge that. For a passively purged canister, the proposed procedure would rely on the pressure decrease in the fuel tank due to a temperature drop from 95 to 65 degrees to draw in air and purge the canister. For an actively purged canister, the procedure would rely on the 15-minute engine run to purge the canister. ARB's goal is to have the test procedure be more representative of real-world use. And we've received feedback that the proposed procedure may not be more representative of real-world use than the existing procedure, and have invited alternative proposals based on data that I've mentioned that was shared with us yesterday. We are reviewing a proposal for actively purged canisters, and separately, proposal for passively purged canisters has been shared with us as well. Prior to last week, the feedback ARB had received consisted largely of requests to return the canister purging procedure to the existing procedure on the basis that industry suspected removing the 400 bed volume purge would result in an increase in emissions or failure of evaporative families to meet the diurnal emission standards. It was pointed out that the testing ARB staff performed with E10 fuel in preparation for this rulemaking included that 400 bed volume purge. And some manufacturers inquired about the possibility of applying a load to an engine to increase the purge rate, or running the engine for more than 15 minutes to ensure greater purge. However, the only proposal received prior to last week was to retain the 400 bed volume purge and run 2 consecutive diurnal emission tests. That proposal was later withdrawn, and last week staff received a proposal to use 1 fuel tank volume of air to purge a passively purged canister, which we are reviewing and considering. Since passively purged canisters rely on a pressure decrease in the fuel tank to draw in purge air, 1 fuel tank volume is the maximum volume of air that could be drawn in at one time, which would only occur if the fuel tank was nearly empty. Although these proposals have been made, No data have been presented to ARB staff showing that removing the purge will result in failure of the tests. Sorry, failure of systems to meet the diurnal emission standards. ARB staff has performed some testing without purging the canister on some units included in the E10 study done leading up to the board hearing to assess the difference in emissions rates with the purge versus without the purge. The first unit tested a tiller with a passively purged canister, showed very similar diurnal emission rates, whether the canister had been purged or not. The result of the first test was 0.720 grams per day without purging the canister. And a second test performed on that unit showed emissions of 0.672 grams per day. The testing that had been done on that unit with a 400 bed volume purge showed emissions of 0.683 to 0.713 grams per day. So very similar rates with and without the purge in this case. And that's believed to be due to the fact that after performing the hot soak test, the canister will be purged as the engine cools from 95 to 65 degrees. A lawnmower with a passively purged canister was also tested without the 400 bed volume canister purge. And this unit did show an increase from 0.535 grams per day with the 400 bed volume purge to 0.675 grams per day without the purge, but it's still well below the standard in this case. A generator with an actively purged canister was tested as well without the 400 bed volume purge and showed emissions of 1.137 grams per day without the purge versus 1.296 to 1.361 grams per day with the 400 bed volume purge. I should note again here that some data were shared with ARB staff yesterday suggesting approximately 18% increase in emissions without the purge versus testing with the purge. And I'll pause again here for questions.
Roger Galt again. Could you describe what the state of the canister or the state of the equipment was, what the preconditioning or whatever you would want to call it was associated with the the non-purge testing? I'm just thinking of the standard test procedure where a unit would do it through preconditioning for a lot of days at high temperature prior to running the test. And I think the initial state of the canister probably has a lot to do with whether you get these kind of results. And then while you're thinking about that or answering that, do you have any explanation on how the generator could actually be better without purge than with purge? It's just, there's kind of no logic there. So.
Yeah, so the first unit, the tiller, was sitting in a building at about 70 degrees Fahrenheit for 10 months with fuel in it prior to this tests. And that 10-month period was from the time it was tested with the purge until it was tested without the purge. That unit was, it's a climate-controlled building where we have our shed. So in that case, relatively constant temperature. It varies a few degrees throughout the day. And it continuously contained fuel. The lawnmower was sitting since November. It had been run in November, but it was in a non-climate controlled building where, in Sacramento, it's been fairly cold since November. The generator was also in that non-climate controlled building. Most of the fuel had been drained out of it. but there was some fuel still in there. In the case of that one performing better without the purge versus with the purge, I don't have a great explanation. I think it could be, just that engines do vary day to day, test to test to some degree. And in this case, it may not have returned to a fully preconditioned state if the fuel had not been wetting all of the fuel line surfaces, for instance.
So while these units were stored since their last test, they were probably roughly a half a tank of fuel because that's what you used for the previous diurnal test?
Yeah, I think the lawnmower was fairly full because we actually mowed some grass with it in November.
Oh, okay.
The tiller was half full, I believe.
Okay.
And the generator was mostly empty.
Okay. I'm just trying to think of through if it had been through the previous shed testing,
Mhm.
which is done with a half a tank of fuel, and then was stored and then it was tested again, how did it lose fuel to get from a half a tank down to whatever it was? It seems like it must have either been drained or...
In that case, we drained most of the fuel.
I see.
But we didn't
Okay.
drain it through the carburetor. We took it out the top.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, test-to-test variability is a subject we talk about frequently, et cetera, but it is, I think the initial canister loading condition has so much to do with whether the purge discussion is relevant or not.
Mhm.
Because it could be anything from equivalent to 400 bed volume purged to fully saturated, and that'll behave entirely differently depending on
Certainly.
that starting
Yeah.
condition. So it's interesting data. I'm not sure what all it tells us, but
Yeah, and I would say, these are preliminary tests on a few units. If we could conclude anything from them, it's that sometimes you don't see a difference, sometimes you do, with and without purging.
Yeah, I'm Takamiyano of the American Honda. My question was basically same as Roger, and I now realized the preconditioning was the temperature is very low, not 38 centigrade. And based on our experience, not only the duration, but temperature very impact significantly about the rest of the test.
Mhm.
So yeah, this is a comment, but I think we should demonstrate how the temperature impacts.
Yes, that's a good point. So it would be interesting to see how units preconditioned at 38 degrees, which is the proposed requirement, would perform in such a scenario. We haven't done that testing. I'm not aware of anyone that has. Any other questions in the audience?
Greg Knott, OPEI. I just wanted to clarify the generator was or was not refueled before the test per the procedure. Just
Oh, it
trying
was,
to clarify
it was filled to 50% with E10. fuel.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I'm just trying to get an idea how the difference could be. Is that E10 fuel the same fuel that had been used in the previous test? Was it 10 months old? How old was the fuel?
There was a brand new drum
Okay, thank
that
you.
was opened. Yeah. We had run out of fuel.
Okay, thanks.
Did we get any questions on email?
Yes, we did have one question. It's from Sunny Laniers from JLP Industries. Related to the scope of these ARB evaporative emission regulations, is it still the case that new farm and construction equipment under 175 horsepower are exempt from these ARB-specific regulations and only EPA EVAP emission regulations apply?
So the short answer is yes. And to clarify for anyone who's not familiar with what the question was asking about, the Federal Clean Air Act has, as amended in 1990, has a sentence in a section that says, no state shall regulate farm or construction equipment under 175 horsepower. I'm paraphrasing, but basically the Federal Clean Air Act prevents California or any other state from regulating farm and construction equipment under 175 horsepower, which means that that equipment is not subject to ARB's SOAR regulations. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. Now we'll move on to costs and benefits. Several of the draft 15-day changes will affect the cost of the amendments. Staff estimate that, including the draft 15-day changes, the amendments would result in a maximum retail price increase of $2.30 per unit, including a 75% markup on manufacturer's costs. This is significantly smaller than the estimate of $3.68 presented at the board hearing in November. The major reasons for the decrease are lower fuel line and fuel cap costs due to the changes to the fuel line permeation and fuel tank testing requirements. These are partially offset by higher sales reporting costs due to the additional information required in the draft 15-day changes. In terms of a percent increase versus the current retail price, an increase of $2.30 would range from a 0.1% increase for, less than 0.1% increase for a $5,000 commercial zero-turn riding mower to a 3.3% increase for a low-end $70 string trimmer. The environmental and health benefits are not expected to change as a result of the draft 15-day changes. Any questions on this? Yeah. Greg's got a question.
Thank you. Greg Knott, OPEI again. Just want to confirm the cost impact analysis has not been revised to reflect the potential need for shed testing based on the fact that all compliance testing will now be shed tested, right? So no additional sheds are accounted for, whether it's third-party labs or manufacturing.
There have not been assumed costs for new sheds for compliance testing.
Okay.
And I'm not sure if you're asking about ARB's testing or if you're asking about manufacturers doing testing because of the potential for ARB to do testing.
The latter,
Oh,
right?
Okay. Yeah, so you're correct that we did not assume increased costs for shed testing based on the design-based equipment being required to meet diurnal standards.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Christopher, I have one from Alex Weaver at ARB regarding the canister purging. Are there any suggested explanations for the canister on E10 to 29 showing a lower emission rate without purging?
In that case, the difference was very small. I'll go back to that slide. I mean, in this case, I would call these results all within the same range with purging and without. We did weigh the canister at various points in the tests, and the canisters seemed to be fully loaded before our first test. And I should note that the second run was done without a second hot soak test. So in that case, the canister would have purged when it was cooling down in the first diurnal test, and then it actually lost more mass in the second diurnal test. So I wouldn't call these results fundamentally, different with purging and without. Any other questions on email? Yeah, we have one here, Mike.
Thank you. This is Tommy Chen from Honda. Another question related to the data. So I assume those are one single data point from each of the equipments?
So can we go back to the slide? The tiller was tested twice without purging, was tested 3 times with purging. So I showed a range in the second sub-bullet for the tiller, 0.683 to 0.713. That reflects 3 tests.
I see.
2 tests were done on that. 1 test was done on the lawnmower, the E1021, without purging. 3 tests were done with purging. And again, the range is shown. The generator, 1 test was done without purging and 3 tests with purging.
I see. Does ARB have any plans to do testing with another unit? So this is the same unit tested multiple times?
Yeah. We may do some additional testing. As I mentioned, we did get some purge rate data shared with us yesterday and some diurnal testing data. So we're going to be reviewing that and discussing whether we need to do additional testing. If we do additional testing, we will share the results.
Okay, thank you. And one more question. The E10-29, does that mean the 29, 21, 25, do they mean the batch number or?
Those are unit numbers assigned in the study that was done to assess emissions of currently available units with E10 fuel. The study was done as part of the rule development process for the amendments that were presented to the board in November 2016. So we just assigned them, we called it the E10 study, we assigned them unit numbers.
Gotcha.
And these are provided for those who, saw the results from that study to be able to identify what units we're talking about here.
Thank you very much.
Roger Galt again. Just to clarify, the with purge data is actually from the E10 study that was done prior to November,
It is. So
right?
those are results that have been published and discussed previously.
Right. So I don't remember what E10-25 generator fuel tank capacity was or the relative standard.
So that's the Leafan generator. It was a 25-liter tank.
So that's a pretty low, 1.3.
It's a pretty low emission rate considering it's a 420 cc engine with a 25-liter tank, but that's how it
Yeah,
came
the
out.
relative standard on a 25-liter tank.
The standard's 2.6.
So
So it's a low emitting
pretty
unit.
low relative to the
Yeah.
standard. Thank you. Oh, and metal tank?
Metal tank,
Okay.
and it didn't leak.
Makes a big difference.
A very big difference. Any other questions, either on this or the costs that we were discussing? Okay. I'll move back ahead then. Okay, last section we will discuss adoption of the regulation amendments. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the board approved adoption of the proposed amendments with 15-day changes at a public meeting in November 2016. After incorporating feedback received on the draft 15-day changes before, during, and after today's workshop, including feedback we received through March 15th, ARB staff will publish 15-day changes to the proposed amendments in spring 2017. This will open a 15-day comment period during which the public can comment on the 15-day changes. Excuse me, I'm having technical difficulties. There we go. During summer 2017, staff will review the comments and address comments received both during the 45-day comment period leading up to the November 2016 public meeting and the 15-day comment period. All of the comments and ARB staff's responses will go in a final statement of reasons that will be submitted along with the amended regulatory text to California's Office of Administrative Law, or OAL, by September 2017. Upon OAL's approval, the amendments will become effective towards the end of 2017. Any questions on the timeline?
Roger Galt once again. Just to clarify, I know we have ongoing discussions about things that are or are not included in the draft 15-day changes, et cetera. But when the final 15-day changes are published in the spring of 2017, that would close out comments associated with anything other than changes that are made in the 15-day package compared to what the board adopted. Is that accurate?
So I'll try to answer, and if I answer the wrong question, tell me. But comments on the proposed amendments that were published in September 2016 were supposed to be submitted in that 45-day comment period.
Yeah, that's closed. That's
right.
ancient history.
So the 15-day comment period, comments should address the 15-day changes. And that's the scope of it, is that
Right. Okay.
what's in the 15-day changes is what's up for comment. Am I answering the right question?
No, that was my understanding as well, and so one of the issues we've been talking about prior to November and continue to talk about today is associated with compliance testing and compliance determination, et cetera. So if the staff chooses not to propose any changes to what was in the November package as part of the 15-day changes, technically we're not in a position to comment any further about those issues because that book is closed at that point.
So, disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer.
Neither am I, so we're okay.
Yet my understanding is that, I mean, that would fall outside of the scope. So
Right.
essentially, you're correct. Our requirements under California law are to, address the comments that we receive in the 45-day and 15-day comment period and show that we've, considered them and either made appropriate changes or given a justification for not making changes.
Okay. In regard to the compliance requirements, et cetera, and I don't want to get too far off track today, but I do think that there's kind of some history there associated with what happened at the board hearing, et cetera, that I think needs to be part of the staff's assessment that we haven't necessarily talked about yet, and we can talk about that offline. I don't want to muddy the water too much here today in this venue if it's really not part of your current 15-day package discussion, so.
No, but it is 11 o'clock and I don't have any more slides, so.
Okay, well, being as how I have the mic, at issue, and you're well aware of this, is associated with how many units are tested to determine compliance and what the relative compliance limit is. Is it the absolute standard or family emission limit, or is it something adjusted higher than that? In my testimony to the board back in November, as I recall. Part of my comment was associated with the rule proposed at the time that I characterized as one and done. Basically, the agency was required to test one unit. If that unit failed, the family was determined to be non-compliant. Staff's response to the board indicated that that was not the case, that a minimum of 5 units would be tested. And that hasn't been reflected anywhere that I've seen.
So, my recollection, based on your comments and Michael Benjamin, our division chief at the Monitoring Laboratory Division, his response was that if ARB tests a unit for compliance testing and it fails, greater than the 5% buffer that's built in on the initial test, that 5 units would be chosen for the manufacturer to test. And I understand that that may not have been clear in the way he described it, but what he was describing is what is in actually the existing text today and is retained, is that if a failure occurs, the manufacturer has 30 days to notify the executive officer of their intent to provide testing. So within 30 days, they will say, I intend to provide additional information, including testing for 5 units. So those units will be chosen and tested in an independent lab arranged by the manufacturer. And that testing of those 5 units will be used to, in the executive officer's determination of whether a non-compliance problem exists in the first place, and if so, whether suspension or revocation of the executive order is a necessary consequence.
I think I gathered all of that except for where the 5 units comes in, and that is, as I read the current, you're correct. It does say that the manufacturer can provide additional information for the executive officer consideration. But I don't find anywhere where it says 5 units. It could be 2, it could be 10, it could be, it's just wide open at the moment.
Yeah.
And I wasn't sure if that was the intent, to leave it wide open, if there was some expectation that there would be a predetermined minimum number of additional test units to be run, or some other criteria associated with what manufacturer provided information that would be relevant to that circumstance. And I know we've had a lot of discussion about who would do, that testing and where the testing would be done. But perhaps maybe at the moment we just focus on if the 5 units is sort of a magic number, so to speak, and where we would find that if we were looking for it down the road, or whoever the compliance officer is at ARB that's trying to make this determination would find it.
Yeah, so I don't have the text to put up on the screen, but I can read from it.
Okay.
In section 2765 of the regulations, subsection B, it's a long paragraph, so I won't read the whole thing, but it says, the holder of the executive order of certification shall have 30 days in which to notify the executive officer of their intent to provide additional information and/or independent test results for 5 fuel lines, carbon canisters, fuel tanks, engines, or equipment units selected by the executive officer that document compliance with the evaporative family.
So that's where the 5 comes from.
Yeah, it says 5. And the 5 is in there today. Some words in that sentence are added or modified
Sure.
in the proposed amendments, but the 5 is there and is retained.
Okay. Thanks.
Additional questions on the timeline or anything else we've discussed?
So on slide, oh, this is Sarah with Honda, Sarah Shomari with Honda. On slide 12, I don't know if you can bring that up.
Just give me a moment.
So annual sales by equipment type, as you know, Honda, we make engines, they go into other people's equipment. Are you expecting us to know X amount goes into a lawnmower or certain amount go into a tiller? I mean,
So-
obviously, that's something that we would not know. That's what I was wondering too.
So, in your case, my understanding is that you have evaporative families that you certify,
Yeah,
and other companies use your engines in evaporative families. So you as Honda would not be reporting about anyone else's evaporative families except Honda's.
okay. And that would just be by family. And
Right.
then they would be so it could be that the engine's recorded twice? Because we would still be recording our annual,
Well,
production.
you would be, Honda would be reporting engine production numbers
Mhm.
under the exhaust regulations.
But not under for our
Uh,
VAP families.
For your evaporative families, you would report evaporative family production of Honda's evaporative families. If
Okay.
you produce engines and sell them to someone else who certifies an evaporative family, they would report the sales of those engines in their evaporative
But
families.
if we're also certifying our evaporative family,
Yeah, so you would report your engine production under the exhaust regulations,
Okay.
and you'd report your evaporative family production or sales. I know we talked about production versus sales, and really the practical thing to report here is production.
Yeah.
Although the language says sales, and it's an ongoing discussion.
Okay.
So the way we envision this working out is that we would see Honda reports a certain number of engines, engines produced under the exhaust regulation, and some of those would be reported on the EVAP side by Honda, and some by your customers who use your engines and certify their own evaporative families.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, if that's as clear as mud, we can discuss later.
This is JJ Zielstra with Kawasaki. I think just following up on that thought, there may be situations where an engine manufacturer may be selling the engine gas tank unit as a full unit and have the evaporative certification for that, but we may not know what it's going on necessarily.
So
equipment-wise.
if
So
you
I wouldn't-
sell, for instance, let's call it a lawnmower engine, right? Which probably happens. You certify that lawnmower engine tank and everything. You sell it to someone who just makes lawnmowers and doesn't certify evaporative families. They would buy a certain number of engines from you, and you wouldn't know if they put it on lawnmowers or pressure washers or whatever, but they could tell you what they put it on. So you would know how many engines you sold them, and they would have to give you the information potentially if that's how it works out.
You go ahead.
This is Roger Galt. Yeah, that twist that you just brought into there is problematic. Engine manufacturers that are certifying the evaporative family because they're building a complete fuel system, tank, whatever that system is, tank, engine, canister, whatever, and selling it, especially small horizontals, that could go on 25 different products, and trying to get that feedback from those OEM customers and put it together in a timely manner for your sales report or production report ain't gonna happen. Especially if you're looking for any resolution on that in terms of accuracy. If you're okay with it being, 50, 60% complete, and the other being, we don't know what product it went on, you might get that. But if you're looking for, 25 different equipment types that a given Evaporative family certified by an engine manufacturer go to? And then the breakdown of those, not gonna happen.
Well, I would just, to put things in perspective, today we don't get sales information on this. So what we're looking for is an improvement in terms of equipment type sales. So I would remind you also that we're looking for estimates because we know that exact
Right.
sales numbers are not known. So when I, suggested that a customer who buys engines could report back on what those were installed in, that could be an estimate as well. So we're not looking for, exactly how many lawnmowers and tillers and whatever those were put in. We're looking for estimates. So, perhaps.
I assume to
when-
tie it back to your inventory is the reason you're looking for the
Yeah, and-
equipment information?
And the goal is to improve the information we have to improve the inventory.
Right.
So,
So I'm wondering if we look at that, and I think it's a pretty long list. I think, Greg, you have a better idea than I do, but. Yeah, well, that's probably less than the real world. I'm wondering if we should consider as part of this reporting process that a manufacturer could estimate how many of a given engine family, evap family combination went to, whatever those equipment types are that are in the model. So if you have a small horizontal engine, the fact it's not going to probably go in a lawnmower, it's probably not going to go in a tractor. You can probably limit it to 3 or 4, maybe 10 different applications, horizontals being probably the most diverse. Small verticals, class 1 verticals, lawnmowers I think are relatively easy to disseminate compared to others because of other features. Maybe we should look at those equipment types and figure out if there's some way to simplify that reporting process to get the estimates closer for what your purpose is. I think we're all trying to figure out what the real request is, because I hadn't even thought about the engine manufacturer reporting on equipment applications until it just came up. That's going to be a challenge.
yeah, so it's not our goal to introduce complexity, but to get better information. So we recognize that it's not going to be perfect, but getting some estimate is going to be better than getting nothing. Even if it's a crude estimate,
Yeah.
which it may need to be.
Well, the total production for, in this case, an engine manufacturer, evap family, that number is probably relatively robust. Kind of know what you built. Knowing the split of those and where they go, that's going to get dicey. But we'll try and figure out some way to give you as much information as available. If it, as I said earlier, I think we probably can do a pretty good job on 50%, 70%, depending on the engine. As long as you're not looking for perfect, we'll work with you guys to try and figure out how to get you as much information
Yeah, I mean,
as reasonably possible.
We're looking for some information. We're not looking for perfect, and
And it could be based on the intended application, meaning Honda or whoever the engine manufacturer is selling engines to 25 different customers, but part of that process is understanding, unless it's going through a distributor, what they're actually intending to use that engine on and what the OEM application is. So, if you sell it to somebody to put on, tillers and pressure washers and whatever, maybe the same customer, maybe the same engine, it's going to get pretty messy in terms of precision, but I think we can try and figure out something to give some information at least.
yeah, and
Hopefully I'm not putting our guys in too big a box.
This information will be used to complement information we get in our survey of California homeowners and businesses where we ask them questions such as, what lawn and garden and outdoor power equipment do you have, which helps us to estimate the statewide population of various equipment types. Having that complementary estimated information from manufacturers on how many of each equipment type were sold will help us improve that information in the inventory. And the language does provide flexibility in terms of how these reports are done. It says in section 2761, which includes the sales reporting requirements in subsection F2, upon executive officer approval, a holder may calculate its eligible sales through market analysis. An educated and consistent estimate with the best available documentation will be acceptable as the final sales report. So that's intended to provide flexibility where we assume that manufacturers are going to give us their best estimate of the information we're asking for, and we recognize that's as good as we're going to do. Question back there.
This is Greg from ECI Fuel Systems. It's kind of the same thing from a different component. We make fuel systems, and for us, it's the same issue. I mean, we don't know exactly what our tank is going to end up on, and it's going to be very questionable, the accuracy of what I could provide. I mean, so I just kind of repeating what these other guys have said, but maybe maybe you're looking more for, like, you call manufacturers, but we're maybe more like component people than finished, like, motorcycles or lawn equipment. Like, the finished product is
Right.
unclear to the component manufacturer.
Yeah, so, another thing is that on the certification application, one of the fields you fill in is what equipment types will this evaporative family be used on? And you've got check boxes, right? So everyone checks some box. So, in your case, maybe you check the refueling system box or the, generator box. So everyone indicates some number of different equipment types that the evaporative family will be used on. So they have to have some idea of where these things are going. And what we're looking for here is an estimate, really, of where they go.
Okay.
So, produce a fuel system, you sell it to someone, you say, well, what do you think these are going to be used on? Oh, 50% generators, 50% refueling systems. That's good enough. Go ahead, Mark.
Mark Mercola, MTD. Not to belabor the point, but from an equipment manufacturer side, a lot of our engine suppliers also compete with us on the equipment side. And so there might be some confidentiality issues with giving them exact production numbers with their engines. Understanding the estimates could kind of get around all of that, but I think there would be a very real concern about providing exact numbers.
Would reporting that estimate to ARB instead of the engine manufacturer help?
I mean, it would probably help the engine manufacturer in that they have less work to do, but I understand what you're saying. I mean, it could be done. If we made the categories general enough, it might be easier so that you couldn't pull out specific information. I think a part of it too, if you really want to get at how much are walk-behind mowers, how much are chore-related items, walks being required to be diurnally certified, I think you can go ahead and look at, from an engine manufacturer perspective, which of their families are diurnally certified. For the most part, those are going to be walk-related applications.
Well, and they tend to be single application evaporative families. So in that case, there's not much required there. I know it's not always the case, but yeah, in that case, that it's a simpler example, walk-behind mowers. Yeah, Mark and Sarah and Mr. Yano. That's why we have 2 hours.
Mark Swanson, Walbro. Just to clarify that, the sales reporting is not for component manufacturers?
Correct.
Okay.
It's for evaporative families, which means something with an engine and a complete evaporative emission control system.
Just another thing to point out, again, Sarah with Honda. Estimations, I was thinking for California sales, but now if we have to know specific equipment sales by evaporative family with multiple equipments and also only California, this is adding even another layer to that estimated number. So, and also one of our, engine evaporative engines with the evap system, we have multiple, some of them have multiple categories with tillers and pressure washers, generators, et cetera. And then there's also that other box on the application where we wouldn't know what equipment they're going in. So just to point out, it would really be quite impossible off the top of my head.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think other equipment types might be a small percentage. If it's not, then, I'm wrong. But really, we're looking for an improvement over no sales information. So, yesterday when we were talking, I think Greg may have pointed out, walk-behind lawnmowers are 30% of the market. So in general, that number seems to be understood. So we're looking for estimates, and if that's the kind of estimate we end up with, based on general market data, I know you produce everything, and then you have to estimate what comes to California, because you don't know what actually ends up here, especially if it's in a big box store. And then with the estimating equipment types, if you have to rely on general market data to make those estimates, it's at least some information to improve our estimates. Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Yano.
Yeah, Yano of Honda. I would like to confirm the purpose of this reporting. I guess this is for estimation of the modeling of the emission inventory. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is to help improve the emissions inventory.
Okay. So for that purpose, I think we should say, rather than such a estimation of the actual sales by using limited retail records, I think just simple about family production number is more accurate.
So, if I understand correctly, you're saying that the manufacturer could provide a more accurate number if it was just the evaporative family. But then, in that case, we'd have an accurate evaporative family number, and ARB would have to do the estimating of the equipment types when there are multiple equipment types included in an evaporative family. So, at that point, we would have to give our best estimate. And I'm not sure we're in a better position to do that than the manufacturer.
Oh, okay.
For the scenario where the engine manufacturer is the VAP family producer and reporter, would we avoid some of the concerns that Mark raised, et cetera, if the engine manufacturer said, okay, here's my total evap family production, and based on who I sold those engines to and what applications they told us they were going to put it on, I'm going to give you the breakdown, ARB, of what we think that total mix is. And per the certification application, it's these things with check boxes, and it's the other category.
Yeah.
And That way, the engine manufacturer is not going back to the equipment manufacturer and asking him anything, but looking at their own internal information in terms of who they sold those engines to and what they expected them to be used on. And, you know, if they sold it to one customer that might have 3 applications, they're gonna have to guess. But to your point, they can probably guess better than you could after the fact.
I'm
Would
pretty
that-
sure they can guess better than we can, right?
Would that help some? I mean, it, just kind of thinking outside the box, trying to help your inventory assessment, because we all know that's a critical driver to
Yeah.
where we're at and where we're trying to go.
So, you know, this conversation is very useful for us. I hope it's useful for you as well. Kind of the underlying issue that we need to resolve in terms of these 15-day changes is, does the flexibility text provide you with the ability to do something that will work? And if not, what text would provide that flexibility?
We'll have to look at the text.
Yeah, you don't have to answer it right now. Take a look at it and let us know before March 15th. But we want that flexibility to be there, and we want to work out these details so that we can not argue over the emissions inventory when we're talking about equipment types. And we may still argue about it, but we'd like to minimize it, right? So we'd like to have as good of information with the needed flexibility for confidentiality and other business purposes, so that we can get the information estimates from you and minimize the arguments about equipment types in the inventory.
Okay, Greg Knott, OPEI. Just to clarify, the 30% was based off of ARB's model for walk behind. I just wanted to clarify that point that you mentioned. I said 30% yesterday. That was based off ARB's model. Could we go to slide 11, please?
Yeah, just a minute.
I wanted to talk about the fuel tank filling requirement just a little bit more. So slide 11 says the fuel tank nominal capacity validation, and we've had a lot of discussion yesterday about what filling a tank means, what the consumer fills it to versus what a manufacturer might recommend. And nominal capacity is well defined. It says specifically, sorry, I just lost my page. Nominal capacity is defined as, it means the volume of fuel indicated by the manufacturer that represents the maximum recommended fill level. And that's what's used in this slide. Nominal capacity is also what's used in 2765. But the discussion we had yesterday was ARB would fill the tank until full. So is ARB going to adjust the definition of nominal capacity?
I think that's something we need to continue to talk about. We would like to see the nominal capacity, which is a recommended, you know, as defined here, recommended by the manufacturer. We'd like to see that represent the practical amount of fuel that someone can put in the tank when they see that it's full without spilling, including when they put on the fuel cap. So I'm not talking about filling to the top of the lip and when you put the fuel cap on, it splashes.
Okay. Because yeah, it's at least the way it's written now. I mean, again, nominal capacity is extremely clear. It shouldn't be a point of contention at all, but it seems different than what you're looking for.
We just want that recommendation to match what is practical to do when you go to fill the tank completely, so that you can use the product as long as possible.
Okay, I think we'll take a look at that and hopefully can maybe suggest an alternative definition or some filling things to look at. Second thing, I wanted to jump back to something Roger was talking about earlier, and it's with regards to the compliance testing and with regards to the one and done specifically. And Dr. Benjamin's comment to the board was in response to the one and done testimony, that one and done was, he said, quite honestly untrue. And Dr. Benjamin said the process will consist of ARB then going back and testing an additional 5 units obtained from a manufacturer at an independent lab, and then will give us an assurance that the equipment is compliant. So what Dr. Benjamin said was extremely different than what's in the language right now. And that's concerning because that's what the board made a determination off of, ARB staff's suggestions and responses. So I don't want to belabor it too much more. You've identified what's in the current language and maybe what the intention of his statement was, but the intention of his statement versus the impact it may have had on the board's decision could be significantly different, and it concerns us.
So first of all, I'm assuming you're reading from the transcript or your
Yeah, I
notes?
watched the video several times.
Yeah.
And
So, I mean, what I heard it sounds like what I recall hearing in November when he was speaking is that ARB would test 5 units in an independent lab. So what I've described is that 5 units would be tested in an independent lab, but I said the manufacturer would contract with the lab. So whether it's ARB testing at the independent lab or manufacturer contracting with that lab, I think the effect is the same, in that 5 units would be tested at an independent lab. And if ARB would obviously be interested in the results and may want to attend the testing.
I think the concern is that there's an initial determination based off that 1 unit. Now, if ARB was going to do 5 more units and make an initial determination at that stage, it's a completely different ballgame from a compliance, from potentially a penalty, you know, all those things, and how all those things unfold, and the responsibility for the manufacturer then to prove they are or are not compliant. So I think it's a lot different if ARB says we're going to test 5 more units versus a manufacturer saying we'll test 5 more units at an independent lab. So I think we have a different opinion here on the impact of that. So I guess I'll leave it at that. We're disappointed that those changes aren't reflected and the impact that could have had on the overall decision.
So I understand. First of all, I hear your point that you understood that ARB would do additional testing. So I understand. Are you saying that you were expecting that the regulation language would reflect ARB doing a second round of testing before the manufacturer having an opportunity to do testing?
That was certainly the way it was communicated to the board, is my point. And again, that could have had an influence on their overall decision.
We'll relay that feedback.
Yes, while we're talking about the subject and trying to figure out what it all means, et cetera, the other thing that I think is sort of in there is related to the status of that manufacturer's evaporative family status, so to speak, and the time frame associated with whoever does whatever people do. We could be trying to read too much into it, but the one and done comment, et cetera, was our understanding that the executive officer would, based on that initial test, suspend or revoke. We may be misreading the text, but we know that in order to complete testing of additional units, a substantial amount of time will lapse. And one of the things that's unclear for manufacturers was what does that mean to their ability to continue to produce product and distribute product under that executive order or not. So trying to figure out, you know, the business implications of this is really important stuff. And that's, I'm not saying you guys don't get that, but I think it's important that we make sure we all are on the same page there.
I think what Christopher's saying is we hear you. We'll go back and look at the language, and and add that clarification that's needed. I need to go back and look at the transcripts as to what Michael Benjamin indicated to the board versus what's written. I think his intent was to say that we will secure 5 additional units to be tested, whether that is the manufacturer selecting the independent contractor working with ARB. I think it's a collaboration, what was his intent. And I don't think the intent is that sales would be revocated at that point. Once there's an exceedance, additional information needs to be gathered, and through those 5 additional tests, and then a decision will be made. But we hear you. We'll get the clarification. We'll put that in the language so that everybody's on the same page on that.
And I would note, Roger, in section 2765, subsection C, which is the compliance testing section, it says the executive officer shall not revoke or suspend the executive order of certification without considering any information provided by the holder of such certification pursuant to paragraph B above. Paragraph B is what we were talking about earlier, where it says that 5 additional units may be tested. So the regulation specifically says you can't, executive officer cannot suspend or revoke without considering that information. So it wouldn't be test 1 unit and then it's suspended.
But we'll make sure the language, if it's not, it sounds like you've identified it where it is, but still sounds like there might be some misunderstanding. So we'll look at where there's an opportunity to clarify.
We have email questions.
The first question is from Carol Gardner from Textron. Did CARB survey fuel line manufacturers to get an understanding that the fuel line cost will go down because fuel line pre-certs, such as getting an EO for the hose, will lead the fuel line manufacturer to lower costs? If you subtract for fuel line manufacturer testing, why has added cost for doing equipment testing not been added?
Okay, so I'm going to try to answer that question, and Carol, if I don't answer it properly, send us a follow-up. Can we go back to the slide, Paul? So on slide 19, where we discuss costs, I mentioned that there were decreased fuel line and fuel cap costs. What this refers to is a decrease in the cost for fuel lines and fuel caps versus the proposed amendments that were published in September 2016 and brought to the board in November. So in that proposed amendments, we had proposed that fuel lines that are used for connecting canisters that only contain fuel vapors and fuel lines used for returning fuel from the carburetor to the fuel tank for handheld engines would have to meet the low permeation requirement. By exempting those types of fuel lines from the permeation requirement in the 15-day changes, the increased cost for those fuel lines has gone away, which means that the impact is a lowering of the cost estimate in the draft 15-day changes versus the proposed amendments that were brought to the board in November 2016. So this isn't a decrease in fuel line costs versus the existing situation in 2017. It's a decrease in the proposed costs going forward. Any questions on that in the audience? Do we have another email question?
We do. The second question is from Jeff Ward with Agri-Industrial. From the last working group meeting, my understanding was that the fuel tank manufacturer who certifies the tank would not be required to report sales data. as the OEMs would be responsible for reporting this, given that they would have the data as to what vehicles were sold in California. The current conversation makes it sound like the tank manufacturer would still be required to report all production data, but it's not very clear. What is the exact intention here? There is absolutely no way that we will get information from the OEM on where these tanks are going.
So, Jeff, you are correct that fuel tank manufacturers do not have to report sales of their fuel tanks at all. In section 2761, subsection F of the regulation, it describes the sales reports, and it says, a holder shall submit end-of-year and final sales reports for all of the holders' evaporative families. So evaporative families is a defined term in section 2752, where all of the definitions for the regulations appear. Evaporative family does not mean fuel tanks. It means complete assemblies with evaporative emission control systems. So the requirement is for only for evaporative families, not for fuel tanks or fuel lines or carbon canisters to report sales. Any other email questions?
No.
Any in the audience? Well, we will continue our discussions. We welcome additional feedback on the draft 15-day changes. I think we will definitely continue to talk about sales reports, and we welcome any proposed changes to the language to provide necessary flexibility to make those reports feasible to put together for manufacturers and other executive order holders. And we can talk about the details of really what can be provided and what we're looking for at ARB. We'll also continue to talk about carbon canister purging. We welcome any additional data that anyone has to submit, or any additional discussions on the data we presented or data that's been shared with us previously. If there are any other topics anyone wants to provide feedback on, we welcome additional feedback through March 15th so that we can, at that point, finalize the 15-day changes for publication in the spring to get this out for public comment. So thanks again, everyone, for all of the useful discussion and for flying out here from various parts of the world in the country. I think if there are no additional questions, we will conclude the workshop, and we can put up contact information here for Angus and for me. So thanks again, everyone.